Washington doesn't usually move all at once. It stalls, it postures, it argues, but every so often there's a moment when the entire city seems to freeze, when even seasoned lawmakers realize something has gone terribly wrong. This is one of those moments. In a stunning and almost unthinkable development, 47 members of Congress have now formally called for Donald Trump to resign. And this isn't coming only from the opposition. 16 of those lawmakers belong to his own party. That detail alone is what makes this moment different and far more dangerous for the president than any routine political scandal or cable news outrage cycle. Calls for resignation are extraordinarily rare in American politics. They don't happen because of harsh rhetoric, unpopular policies, or partisan frustration. They happen only when lawmakers believe a president has crossed a line so serious that party loyalty can no longer justify silence. When members of Congress are willing to risk their careers, their donor support, and the fury of their own base, it signals that the stakes have suddenly shifted. This wasn't a choreographed stunt or symbolic protest. It was a bipartisan rupture triggered by information so alarming that even longtime allies concluded they could not defend it or themselves if they stayed quiet. Republican committee leaders breaking ranks is not political theater. It is a warning flare. For Americans watching from home, especially those who care about national security and constitutional limits on power, this moment should stop you cold. When Congress turns against a sitting president in this way, it's not about politics anymore. It's about whether the system itself is sounding an alarm and whether anyone in power is still willing to listen. What forced this break wasn't a rumor, a leak taken out of context, or a familiar partisan accusation. It was a classified memo reviewed inside a secure facility that lawmakers from both parties say crossed a line they had never seen crossed before. According to multiple sources briefed on its contents, the document details alleged direct interference by Donald Trump in ongoing military operations, not for strategic or defensive reasons, but for personal political leverage. This is where even loyal allies reportedly went silent. The memo does not describe a disagreement over military strategy or a dispute between civilian leadership and generals. Instead, it outlines instructions to delay critical defense authorizations while sensitive missions were underway. These were not abstract policy debates. They were time-sensitive operations tied to intelligence collection and force protection in hostile environments where hesitation can put American lives at risk. What stunned lawmakers was the alleged condition attached to those delays. Sources say authorizations would not move forward until certain senior military leaders agreed to publicly support political messaging and appear at campaign-style events. That is the point where this stopped being controversial and became intolerable. National defense, according to the memo, was being used as leverage, a bargaining chip in a political transaction. For members of Congress who have spent careers defending strong executive authority, especially Republicans who traditionally champion presidential control of the military, this was a breaking point. Civilian control of the armed forces depends on one sacred rule: military decisions must serve national security, not personal ambition. Once that rule is violated, loyalty becomes complicity. That's why silence wasn't an option anymore. For lawmakers who saw the memo firsthand, doing nothing would have meant accepting a precedent where military readiness could be paused for political advantage, and that is a risk they say the country simply cannot afford. The moment everything changed didn't happen on television. It happened behind closed doors, inside a secure room where phones were banned, doors were sealed, and politics was supposed to stay outside. After reviewing the leaked memo, a bipartisan group of lawmakers convened an emergency session that sources describe as tense, quiet, and deeply unsettling. This was not a meeting filled with speeches or posturing. It was a reckoning. The group included senior members from both parties, including Republicans who had defended Donald Trump through every previous controversy. As the memo was reviewed, line by line, the mood reportedly shifted from disbelief to alarm. Several lawmakers are said to have asked the same question in different ways. If this is accurate, how do we justify staying silent? What broke the dam came from within the president's own party. According to multiple sources familiar with the meeting, a Republican congressman who chairs a key foreign policy committee spoke bluntly, warning colleagues that ignoring what they had just read would make them complicit. He reportedly said this was no longer about party, elections, or ideology. It was about whether Congress still had the courage to act when national security was placed at risk. Democrats in the room echoed the same concern. But the significance was that they didn't have to lead the charge. The gravity of the memo spoke for itself. By the end of the closed-door session, the decision was no longer whether to respond, but how quickly. That's when the unthinkable happened. A formal resignation letter was drafted on the spot with signatures from both sides of the aisle. In that sealed room, party lines collapsed, replaced by a shared conclusion that the line had already been crossed. The letter that emerged from that closed-door meeting was unlike the carefully hedged statements Washington usually produces. It was blunt, direct, and rooted in constitutional language rather than political spin. Addressed to the nation and to Donald Trump himself, it asserted that the most fundamental responsibility of the office, the duty of commander-in-chief, had been violated. According to lawmakers who reviewed the full text, the letter accused the president of placing personal political objectives above the safety and readiness of the United States military. It did not argue policy disagreements or question judgment calls made in good faith. Instead, it framed the alleged actions as a breach of the oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, emphasizing that military power exists to defend the nation, not to serve electoral ambition. The wording was striking precisely because it avoided emotional language. There were no accusations of motive beyond what the memo allegedly documented, no partisan jabs. Just a cold legal assertion that delaying military authorizations to extract political loyalty from commanders undermines civilian control of the armed forces and endangers lives. Lawmakers described the letter as reading more like an indictment than a press release. One passage reportedly emphasized that service members depend on civilian leaders to act in the national interest, especially when missions are time-sensitive and conditions are volatile. To politicize that process, the letter warned, erodes trust not only within the military, but between the armed forces and the government they serve. By calling for resignation rather than impeachment at this stage, the authors sent a clear message. This was not about scoring points or launching a partisan battle. It was about drawing a hard line and signaling that some actions are so incompatible with the responsibilities of the presidency that stepping aside is the only acceptable outcome. The true gravity of this crisis became unmistakable on the House floor. Not during a fiery Democratic speech or a televised committee hearing, but in a moment few in Washington ever expected to witness. A Republican lawmaker, a committee chairman, a military veteran, and a longtime defender of Donald Trump rose to speak and read the resignation demand aloud himself. According to reporters in the chamber, the room fell silent. There was no applause, no heckling, no partisan theater. His voice, witnesses said, wavered as he spoke, and that alone told the story. This was not a political ambush. This was someone crossing a line he never wanted to cross. He made clear that this decision did not come easily. He acknowledged his past support for the president and his belief in strong executive authority, but he also said there comes a moment when loyalty to country must outweigh loyalty to any individual. As a veteran, he explained, he could not justify remaining silent when evidence suggested that military operations may have been delayed for political gain. That was the moment the scandal transformed into something far more dangerous for the White House. When opposition lawmakers criticize a president, the public expects it. When allies do so quietly, it can be dismissed as internal disagreement. But when a senior figure from the president's own party stands on the House floor and reads a demand for resignation, the usual defenses collapse. Claims of a partisan witch hunt lose credibility instantly. The shield of party unity cracks, and other lawmakers watching in real time are forced to confront a new political reality. Defending the indefensible may now be riskier than breaking ranks. From that moment on, this was no longer just about allegations in a memo. It was about a visible rupture, one that signaled to Washington, the military, and the country that something fundamental had broken, and it could not be quietly patched over. History offers a few moments that help explain why this situation feels so different and so dangerous. The closest parallel is Watergate, when evidence mounted that Richard Nixon had abused his power to obstruct justice. The political dynamic didn't collapse overnight. At first, party loyalty held, but once national institutions, the courts, the Justice Department, and eventually Congress concluded that the presidency itself was being used as a shield for misconduct, Republicans began to withdraw support quietly. That withdrawal became decisive when senior GOP leaders told Nixon he no longer had the votes to survive impeachment. He resigned days later. There was also intense pressure during the Clinton years. Bill Clinton faced calls to resign over dishonesty and personal misconduct. But that moment never fully crossed into bipartisan rupture. Many Americans, and most Democrats, viewed the scandal as morally serious but institutionally contained. Crucially, it did not involve military operations, intelligence, or national security decisions. As a result, party lines largely held. That distinction matters. Scandals tied to personal behavior or political ethics provoke outrage. Scandals tied to national security trigger something else entirely: fear of systemic failure. When the alleged abuse involves the president's role as commander-in-chief, lawmakers are no longer debating character or judgment. They are confronting whether the constitutional structure itself is being compromised. That's why this moment stands apart. The accusation isn't that a president lied, misspoke, or bent political rules. It's that military readiness may have been leveraged for personal political gain. History shows that when abuse of power intersects with national defense, party loyalty becomes fragile. This is the point where political gravity shifts. When members of a president's own party begin to publicly distance themselves over national security, it signals that survival calculus has changed. The lesson of history is blunt. Presidents don't fall because of noise outside their party. They fall when support collapses inside it. At the heart of this controversy is a question Americans rarely have to confront so directly. Does the commander-in-chief actually have limits when it comes to military power? The Constitution grants the president enormous authority over the armed forces, but that authority was never meant to be personal, political, or transactional. It exists to protect the nation, not to advance an individual's ambitions. Legal scholars from across the ideological spectrum have been clear on this point. While the president has broad discretion to approve, delay, or cancel military operations, that discretion must be exercised in the national interest. Using operational decisions as leverage to extract political loyalty crosses from executive judgment into abuse of power. If the allegations outlined in the memo are accurate, experts say the issue is not simply misconduct, it is a constitutional breach. Former federal prosecutors have gone even further, warning that delaying military actions for campaign-related purposes could implicate federal laws prohibiting the misuse of government resources for political gain. In other words, this is not just a political scandal. It is a legal and constitutional crisis unfolding in real time. What makes this moment especially dangerous is the precedent it threatens to set. If a president, any president, can pause critical military authorizations until generals publicly align themselves politically, then civilian control of the military becomes corrupted. Commanders begin operating under political pressure rather than strategic necessity. Trust erodes, and the line separating democratic governance from authoritarian behavior starts to blur. That is why lawmakers say this goes far beyond Donald Trump as an individual. The question now facing Congress is whether the office of the presidency still carries enforceable limits when national security is at stake. If the answer is no, then the consequences extend far beyond this administration and far into the future of American democracy. This moment is bigger than one president, one memo, or one political crisis. It's about the standard America expects from the office that holds the most dangerous power on earth. The bipartisan call for resignation is not rooted in ideology or party rivalry. It's rooted in a shared fear that something fundamental may have been crossed, a line meant to protect the country from exactly this kind of abuse. Supporters of Donald Trump argue that leaks are the real crime, that loyalty demands resistance, that questioning a commander-in-chief weakens the nation. But history shows the opposite. What weakens a democracy is silence when power is misused. What strengthens it is the willingness to draw limits, even when doing so is politically painful. At its core, this crisis asks a simple but uncomfortable question: can national defense ever be treated as a bargaining chip for personal political gain? If the answer is yes, then no future administration is constrained. Military readiness becomes transactional, loyalty replaces judgment, and constitutional safeguards become optional. That is why lawmakers from both parties say this isn't just another scandal to wait out, it's a test of whether accountability still functions when it matters most. Military families are watching, service members are watching, and so are future presidents taking notes on what is tolerated and what is not. The evidence has been reviewed. The demand has been made. What happens next will signal whether the presidency remains bound by duty or whether power, once concentrated, no longer answers to anyone. This isn't just about Trump. It's about who we are and what kind of country we choose to remain.